The main speaker is Professor Brian Raftopoulos, who has spoken twice before, I believe, to the branch. Brian has had many hats. He is now based in the Western Cape and is involved in a wide range of activist as well as scholarly activities. And then as discussant, Professor Roger Southall is an emeritus professor in sociology at the University of the Witwatersrand. And he's the author of a book on liberation movements in power, which deals extensively with ZANU-PF and Zimbabwe. Brian will speak for about half an hour, and Roger then as a discussant for about 15 minutes, and then we have half an hour for questions. So without further ado, over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you to SIRE and IDCPPA for the opportunity to make this presentation. Let me start by saying, I think like many scholars as well as citizens, we are living through and trying to make sense of the dual legacies of both colonial rule and the liberation struggles. And that includes not only the massive inequalities of the past, the legacies of racism, but the promises and the hope of the liberation movements, which did bring some openings, some possibilities economically and politically. But there's two things which have really, two legacies which I think have been quite persistent. That is the structural legacies, long-term structural economic legacies, and the violent and coercive forms of rule that continue to persist in our post-colonial states. And it's those two issues, I think, that have marked the Zimbabwe context very, very, very closely. As the scholar Thandika Mkandawire once said, the new Zimbabwe state had to confront at least 5 challenges: decolonization, deracialization of the economy, economic liberalization, dismantling of sanctions, control measures, democratic questions, and agrarian transformation. These, of course, are not peculiar to Zimbabwe. All post-colonial states have similar kind of problems, South Africa too, but they do have particularities. And of course, one of those particularities is the kind of the legacies of the liberation struggle themselves, not just the hope of new democratic spaces, the anti-colonial discourse, but also the militarization of politics, ethnicization of politics, and the lack of respect for constitutionalism, which has become increasingly apparent in the Zimbabwean context. Now, the 1980s, there was, of course, a period of reconciliation brought about by the Lancaster House Agreement. And as with all of these agreements, whether it is in Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, it was a balance of political and economic power. It was a result of pressures from international, national, and regional pressures, which brought former foes together. And it was, of course, a compromise where many long-term structural questions were put on an abeyance, such as the land question in Zimbabwe, and the control of the private sector, which for many years remained in the hands of the white community, but where there were new opportunities opened up for political dialogue. But along with this language of reconciliation, almost immediately after independence, there was a sign that the repressive forms of rule that would come to dominate the post-2000 were already present. That took place in the Gukuraunde massacres in Matabeleland and Midlands in Zimbabwe, where ethnicized forms of struggle against the opposing liberation movement, ZAPU. And this was really a form of consolidation of ZANU-PF's rule. After the initial period of a unity government, by the mid-1980s, ZANU already moved against its foe, ZAPU, and through massive violence, almost 20,000 people killed, there was this consolidation of power under ZANU-PF, a consolidation which continued throughout the 80s. And by 1987, with the unity agreement, as well as the constitutional amendment, which gave Mugabe greater centralized power, ZANU-PF was moving towards a one-party state. And what's interesting, of course, about the Gukraunde period is that there was very little critique coming from the Western countries. That was largely because of the Cold War period. Mugabe was still considered something of a possibility to stabilize the region, and therefore there was not much criticism of what was going on within the country, the violence and coercion that was there. And so that, as I said, that legacy of coercive forms of rule was already apparent. For civil society, the trade unions were very much at that time under the control of the state. NGOs were working towards more developmentalism and trying to complement the state than any kind of critique. But what was also apparent is that the structural inequalities were not being dealt with. There was very little advancement, black advancement in the economy, and certainly very little advancement around the land question at this time. And so the discussion of unity was tied to certain forms of repression as well as lack of movement around the economy. This began to change towards in the 90s. By the end of the 80s, it was clear that the economic policies that the government had implemented, largely spending a great deal of money on education and health, and very little movement in terms of economic growth, were not working. And the government then moved into a neoliberal economic program and opened up to neoliberal economic policies. And one of the major results of this was a new emergence of new political forces. The trade unions, which had been very much under the cusp of the ruling party, grew into their own autonomous phase. They moved away from the ruling party and started to critique both the movement towards a one-party state, but also the neoliberal programs that had emerged in the 1990s. It was also during this period that new civil society movements began to question the lack of constitutionality, that the constitution which had been developed at Lancaster was not a people's constitution, and therefore a movement called the National Constitutional Assembly developed, which began to demand a people-driven constitution. And this wasn't just about the constitution, it was about questioning whether a liberation party had the right to perpetually define the terms of belonging to the nation. At the constitutional movement, the trade unions were beginning to say that if this is a post-independent, post-colonial state, we should all as citizens have the right to say what are the terms of belonging to Zimbabwe as a nation. And so it opened up discussions about the nation. And this led to the emergence of the movement for democratic change, a new opposition movement, which for the first time challenged the ruling party at the national level. In 2000, there was a constitutional referendum, which the ruling party tried to control and lost. The people's voice spoke, that they tried to control the changes in the constitution. And the referendum which came about said, no, as citizenry, we're not accepting that you as a party can make those changes without our consultation. With this came the introduction or the movement for democratic change, which began to challenge the ruling party at electoral level. And in 2000, made a massive inroads into the electoral space, creating a real possibility of an alternative party. And for a ruling party, a liberation movement, this was a real threat. First of all, it was preceded by strikes in the late 1990s, a general strike, public and private sector workers, but also a massive movement of people who were beginning to question the idea that one party, Liberation Party, could rule forever within the Zimbabwe context. As a response to this, but not only as a response to this, as a result of a long-term demand for land reform, we saw the fast-track land movement, fast-track land program emerge in 2000 and throughout the 2000s, which led to a massive redistribution of land from white farmers to black farmers, a combination of small black farmers, but also elite farmers close to the ruling party. But in terms of forms of rule, what this period also registered was a massive reconfiguration of state power. By that I mean that the state took on an increasingly authoritarian disposition. The civil service was trimmed to relate to ruling party needs, changes in the media and public order rules, the attacks on opposition parties, civil society activists. This all began in the 2000s. And as the MDC grew in prominence, in possibilities, the state repression against oppositional voices grew throughout the 2000s and became really a massive characteristic of Zimbabwe politics in the 2000s. By 2008, though, despite all this repression, there were growing internal cleavages within the ruling party over ethnic questions, over who would take over for Mugabe eventually, but also growing support for the opposition. And in 2008, there was an election in which, for the first time, the Liberation Movement Party was defeated at the elections. And this was a shock to the party. And basically, they refused the will of the people. In response, they refused to accept the results. Even SADC had to step in because it was so clear that ZANU-PF had lost, but refused to give up power. The result was SADC stepped in to go for a re-election. The opposition pulled out because of the massive violence which preceded this pre-election period in 2008. The result was SADC then negotiated with South Africa at its head a global political agreement, which brought the parties into a government of national unity. And for a short period of time, there was certainly a decline in violence, negotiation, cooperation between the ruling party and the opposition as they shared power. But that agreement never negotiated ZANU-PF's hold over the coercive rule of state, of power. That is the army and the police and the secret service. So that throughout that period, even though there was some negotiation, some attempt at reconciliation, the repressive arm of the state remained ready to move when necessary. And it was also during this period that the opposition lost its way a little, trying to concentrate more on state power than on organizing itself in preparation for the 2013 election. So that by the time the 2013 election came, ZANU-PF was much more organized, and it won that election in what was considered to be what was accepted throughout. And in the post-2013 period, the ZANU-PF of old began to come back to its forms of rule, mainly around repression and coercive measures against any form of dissent. But it was also during this period when they felt more confident that the opposition was in abeyance, that the internal politics of ZANU-PF intensified, especially over the future of Mugabe's successor. And there were many factional battles which took place, which eventually resulted in 2017, where Mugabe and his faction, the G40, moved against who they considered the biggest threat, which was Mnangagwa, forcing Mnangagwa into exile. The result of this, although, was that those who supported Mnangagwa effectively carried out a coup in November 2017, which removed Mugabe. And this coup was massively supported by the opposition, by the citizens, because there was the impression that with Mugabe gone, things would change. But what was missed was this was an internal battle between ZANU-PF factions rather than a democratic struggle to open up new spaces. And so when Mnangagwa came to power, he promised a whole range of changes. He took on the language of the opposition. He took on the language of economic reform, constitutionality, international re-engagement, opening up of spaces, and went to the 2018 elections with this discourse, and with the opposition somewhat drawn into it. With the 2018 election, which again were contested, the outcome, which the opposition never accepted, was immediately followed by violence against protesters in 2018 and 2019. And what followed, therefore, was immediately a return to the forms of rule that we knew under Mugabe, but which were now even more intense. Mnangagwa's strategy since 1919, 2021 has been effectively to dismantle the opposition. And has done this systematically. One, through the judiciary, using the judiciary to declare the popular Nelson Chamisa, MDCA, to declare that Chamisa was an illegitimate leader, bringing in to play leaders with who he could deal with in a more congenial way, people like Douglas Monzora. He also refused the MDCA under Chamisa, the funding which they were entitled to under the Political Parties Act, and he also took away their headquarters. So he effectively removed their resources using the judiciary. Also, there was massive violence against MDC supporters, women in particular, which took place in the post-2018 period. And thirdly, it took on, Mnangagwa then went towards establishing a dialogue forum, which effectively excluded the mass MDCA. It included largely opposition parties which had won no seats at the parliamentary election, but who he pretended to deal with through a policy dialogue, which we were totally in control of, and that he could therefore say to the world and to SADC that, look, I am having dialogue, and the MDCA under Chamisa just refused to enter that dialogue because they saw it for the facade that it was. So that through a combination of arbitrary arrests, violence, unfair bail conditions for opposition activists, criminalization of political debate and dissent, and state sanctioning of abductions and torture, there has been this massive attempt to dismantle the opposition. More recently, in the last year, there's been a constitutional amendment 2, which effectively centralizes the power of Mnangagwa even more. It does this through a number of things. One, it increases his control over the judiciary from the Supreme Court right down throughout the courts, where effectively he has control over who heads the judiciary without much public consultation at all. There's the abolition of the provisions for elected vice presidents, which means that he can continue to appoint his vice presidency, which consolidates his control of the ruling party and the state. He can also appoint additional non-parliamentary ministers who are not elected through parliament, as well as party MPs or from the youth and the women, a quota system which is under his control. And so this amendment number 2 has given him even more power than Mugabe had and consolidated his rule, which means that the forms of rule which now dominate Zimbabwe are less to do with legitimacy and increasingly to do with violence and coercion. But more than that the ruling party has also consolidated its control over the economy through cartels. The report earlier this year by Daily Maverick on the cartelization of power in Zimbabwe clearly shows that the ruling party is using cartels of 3 types, as the report notes. These are private sector companies, public sector, public office holders who are using cartels for self-enrichment, and the main type, which is collusive relationship between public officials and the private sector. And this is taking place in the fuel industry, agriculture, COVID-related requirements, that through cartels, the state has effectively used the cartel system and the rent-seeking system to consolidate its rule in the economy, and it's used these cartels to provide finances to consolidate its power in the state. And so whatever growth is coming from the cartels is not expanding the reproduction of the economy. It's not creating new forms of accumulation. It's creating narrow forms of state elites, corrupt accumulation, which is not spreading to the mass of the population. And so you have a massive population which is living in poverty. Now nearly 80% of the population is in the informal sector, whereas we're in the 1980s when the Riddell Commission produced its report, the informal sector could be counted in tens of thousands. So you have this massive informalization for the majority of the population, which is then accompanied by this narrow elite cartel accumulation, which is enriching the few and consolidating the authoritarian nature of political rule. What we've seen, though, as well within the region is that SADC and South Africa have had tried very little to try and do anything about this. The South African attempts in 2019 through Mbeki's visit, the two ANC visits in 2020 were largely dismissed by the Mnangagwa regime, largely because SADC has become largely ineffective in this form unless a particular country leads an initiative on a particular crisis, as South Africa did in 2008 in Zimbabwe. SADC will not move. South Africa, as we know, is deeply entrenched in its own political existential crisis at the moment, and so I feel probably little leverage to be able to place on this authoritarian regime. Not to say that also historically the relationship between ZANU-PF and the ANC has been very problematic, to say the least. So that SADC and South Africa at the moment are really in a very weak position, despite the fact that South Africa remains a key possibility in trying to move things along. The sanctions question in the 2000s, the EU introduced sanctions because of what it said were human rights abuses. So did the US. The US sanctions were much more comprehensive because they effectively stopped the international financial institutions from making any new loans to the Zimbabwe government. Now, while the sanctions have not created the crisis in Zimbabwe, they've certainly exacerbated it. And the sanctions discourse has been used continuously both by Mugabe and Mnangagwa to say that this is a Western regime change agenda, an imperialist agenda, and it has used that narrative to keep SADC and the African Union on its side despite the internal lack of democratic issues. There's also, of course, been a movement towards closer relations with Russia and China. And as we know globally, the Chinese and Russian influence has grown incredibly in the face of the increasing crisis of global liberal democracy, which was dealt a huge blow by the really despicable Trump administration. And so the crisis of liberal democracy has opened up the opportunities for authoritarian regimes like the Mnangagwa one, especially during the COVID period, to say that who are you to preach to us about democracy when your own democracies are in crisis? And so as we've seen globally, there's a massive decline in democratic spaces. And this is the context that the Zimbabwe crisis is facing. And so just to sum up, you've got this systematic dismantling of the opposition that's underway in the context of a regime which is relying increasingly on violence and the monopolization of economic power through cartels in the fuel sector, agriculture, the COVID-related provisions, and that in the face of this, an international context where there seems little hope at the moment that SADC will move, where you'll get very little consensus on how to move on Zimbabwe. And again, international context where the US, I think it's fighting its own attempt to regain its global legitimacy, and where populism, certainly in Europe, has moved to the center, right-wing populism has moved to the center of what were once social democratic regimes. And so we have this crisis, which is not just national and regional and global. And I think that's the context in which we now need to look at what's going on in Zimbabwe. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Brian. It's really fascinating, and people should know I've been able to cheat because Brian sent me a couple of papers which were fascinating. I've got questions much more than comments, really, because there's so much that you've said which is needs to be followed up. There is quite a strong echo in what you're talking about of the 1980 settlement as in many ways being the original sin. In other words, you talk about it, the balance of forces essentially preventing change coming about. The forces were so balanced each other out, and that they set the scene for further struggles. Looking back, how do you think it might have been different within the very severe limitations of the moment? I mean, we know there was the crisis of the war. There was pressure from Mozambique and the other countries which were now SADC and so forth. Everybody wanted a settlement. Might it have been different at all, do you think? But I mean, obviously that's speculative. Other things. Let's kick off with land and the conundrum about ZANU-PF never really getting going with land reform in the 1980s. And you talk about the ZANU-PF never being enthusiastic about radical land redistribution. And yet perpetually we are told that the liberation struggle, not just in Zimbabwe, but throughout Southern Africa, was about the land. So, this is an interest, this is a fascinating contradiction, which I'd quite like if you could explore a little bit more. Certainly you're talking about that there was the growth of a sort of ZANU-PF aligned element of farmers, about 500 black farmers who were tied to the state. But again, you're talking also about there was a ZANU-PF did not want an independent, if you like, landed bourgeoisie to develop. So, and then at the same time, settler capital wasn't particularly interested in assisting change in the land distribution anywhere. And if I recall, the amount of aid which was promised by the decolonizing power, Britain, I think the amount of money which went into the Zimbabwe land issue was proportionally far, far less that went into Kenya, where compared with Zimbabwe, there was a much more successful land resettlement thing. I mean, basically the white farmers cleared out, they were bought out, they moved out pretty voluntarily and pretty quickly. And of course, it was so different in Zimbabwe. So that's something which is fascinating. But the land issue does seem to be the one which has really raised hackles in the Western powers completely, presumably because it's expropriation of property without compensation, which rings a bell down here. So I wonder whether you would talk a little bit about what the lessons might be for South Africa. I mean, one of the things which you're mentioning in your discussion, I don't know whether you mentioned it here, most of the land transfers which went on in the 1980s and 1990s were basically, I read it as white farmers selling off to large commercial concerns. Now, similarly in this country, I think that the overwhelming amount of agricultural production is done by about the commercial firms who only occupy about 20% of the land. And Ben Cousins, for one, says, well, the way for land reform in this country is not to nationalize the commercial firms at the moment, because you would kill agricultural productivity. But you've got plenty of opportunity for taking out the less productive smaller farms at the bottom, and that's where land reform should get going. Now, is there any way that you would like to reflect on the lessons for South Africa on that? Sanctions. Oh, this has been such a testy question for some time, and I think you link it correctly to a Western conception of human rights about the assaults on human rights in terms of bodily violence, cracking down on political rights and so forth, and suggesting that one of the problems with this is that it's been separated from conceptions of rights which are linked to deeper socio-economic problems, which is, I think, well known. Now, we seem to be completely in a dead end on sanctions, because you mentioned it's far too complicated in the US to move it, and anyway, Zimbabwe is way down Joe Biden's problems. The UK, you say, doesn't seem interested. I'm not quite sure why that should be, because Johnson talking about Brexit and so forth, you would think he might be interested in what's going on in Zimbabwe, but I can imagine in the Conservative Party there's a lot of resistance. And the EU, you say, is more hopeful, that the EU is being more constructive. Is there a way out of this sanctions issue, do you think? Because I agree with you that it hasn't worked and it is not constructive. But on the other hand, you don't particularly want to help some of the rogues who have been sanctioned, but how do you work your way through that? You've really, I don't think there's much to say on the South African SADC. I'm sure people will be interested in that. You more or less solved that. Lastly, I think what's come through is you talk about cycles of inclusion and exclusion in Zimbabwean politics. At times, the liberation movement, for one reason or another, has to open up to bring in elements of civil society and political society into its structures, into government. And then when things get convenient to it, or it needs to, it clamps down. There's a cycle of exclusion. And of course, the opposition doesn't help itself because it is so divided and can be so easily bought. Again, do you see any, how do we break that cycle? How do we make a cycle of inclusion to be actually more viable than it is in the conditions where civil society does seem to be so weak? You mentioned that there is, too often we just think of political civil society in terms of political parties, and that there is much more going on the ground. But at the same time, we know that, I'd be interested if you tell us a little bit about that, because one of the things what does seem to happen with the Zimbabwean crisis is much of the crisis is actually externalized. It's been externalized to South Africa. A lot of very able people, well, if they haven't gone off to the US or UK or somewhere, they're in South Africa, they're doing jobs, and they're sending back remittances. And that's in many ways the way many ordinary people in Zimbabwe survive. So again, how do we make a cycle of inclusion actually last? I'll finish there.
Thanks very much, Roger. May I suggest that, Brian, you respond briefly to the major themes or questions that Roger has introduced there, and then we'll move to the number of questions that have been posed in the chat room. Perhaps I could just cluster those under the question of land, sanctions, and inclusion as three sort of broad themes that Roger raised.
Sure.
Brian?
Thank you. Yeah, look, this to answer this would take another half an hour at least. So I'm going to just go through a few. I think the the land question is a very difficult one. We know that for all liberation movements, it's the center of their demands. But what was clear in Zimbabwe is that the government itself was not clear how it would handle it in the post-colonial period. That there were very contradictory signals, as I said in one of my papers. They were certainly not keen to have an independent agrarian bourgeoisie, which wasn't reliant on the party, and that much of the land transfers that took place went to private bodies. And there was a lack of clarity itself. And of course, the aid that came in, there was a problem as Mugabe made known when the Blair government said it was stopping, it was not responsible and was stopping its contributions. And that also triggered a much more radical response. The British government have so often sent the wrong message in the same way they supported the Mnangagwa regime at the time of the coup. So I think, yes, it is a difficult question. In South Africa, we're seeing it. What was clear is that the way that the government handled it in the 2000s, the kind of fast-track movement that they went into was not any planned movement. It was as a result of a combination of pressures from the bottom, as well as the crisis it faced from legitimacy. And it used that form of dealing with the land question to deal with the opposition as well, but which had long-term implications for the sustainability of the economy. We've still today to see any productive linkages between agriculture, mining, and manufacturing, which has effectively been decimated. So the long-term effects of that kind of reform, I think, are still very much under debate, but we're still feeling the effects of it. I think the people like Ben Cousins and others have looked at that question very carefully and have begun to provide much more constructive ways to answer that. So I'll leave it at that for now. The question of sanctions, yes, I think that it's difficult to see where we go at this moment. One of the possible areas is that the Motlanthe Commission, after the 2018 violence, made some recommendations on moving forward, which could become a source of consensus, building consensus in the region and internationally, to build pressure on internal forces in Zimbabwe to say, well, this has come out of your own commission, out of SADC. Is there a way that we can push to get these kind of reforms in place before 2023? It's a long shot, but it may be the only shot we have to kind of move beyond the sanctions, because at the moment, certainly the US will not move. The British government has recently consolidated its current position. The EU have removed many of their sanctions. It just remains on certain individuals and certain companies. The cycle of inclusion, that's the most difficult one. It's one that not just Zimbabwe faces, it's one that's faced in all post-colonial states. And the problem is largely that for elites, the state is the center of accumulation. Because the private sector, they tend to have very little say in the private sector, is very weak. The state becomes the center of all accumulation, economic and political accumulation. And they don't want to share that with anybody else. They know that if they lose state power, they lose legitimacy, they lose their place in the economy. So that the inclusion will only depend on how they feel they can deal with people that they can control. And so this is going to be the most difficult problem, because, as I said, the state and state capture is the center of accumulation, which they refuse to let go of. Let me stop there.
Thanks very much, Brian. We have a number of questions. Let me start with a couple from Chris Saunders, who says, like many others, great presentations. But what about the military? Are they really in charge? And then a number of questioners have referred to the role of civil society. In the absence of organized political opposition, what is the role of civil society? Can they do anything to break the cycle that you have referred to? So let's take those two first. Okay.
To answer Chris's question, of course, with Mnangagwa coming to power, the military was central to that, and the position of the military within various parts of the state has grown since the coup. The question is who is now in control of the military? And that's partly why the Amendment 2, which gives Mnangagwa the right to control the vice presidency, this is being read as his way to control former General Chiwenga and his faction within the military. So that I think the question is, there's still conflicts going on within the military about who will move forward and who will be in control. And that's not likely to go away. And certainly within ZANU-PF, it's been a party riddled with factionalism since the 60s. And that factionalism is not going to go away. What we're seeing now is Mnangagwa increasingly ethnicizing the debate around the Karanga, which is his own ethnicity. His control of the state through ethnicization of positioning within the state and the military is intensifying, and that's likely to lead to further resentments in the future. So this question of the military is still a dangerous one, an open one, and it's one we will have to watch. With regard to civil society, I think the political opposition has been damaged not only by the role of the state, but by its own egregious mistakes. The divisions which have happened because of lack of accountability, lack of democratization, its own ethnic struggles within the opposition, and it's the manner in which the succession in 2017 took place from after Tsvangirai's death, which really was a gift for the ruling party because it created its own constitutional problems and it created a space for Mnangagwa to be able to deal with different factions within the opposition. I think the role of civil society now is more important than ever, because as we're seeing now, the critique of the constitutional amendments is coming out of civil society. The civil rights, human rights debate, I think, is more important than ever. And the role of what remains of civil society, both within the country, but also regionally and internationally, is going to be important in keeping pressure on the Mnangagwa regime around constitutional questions. Just as the constitutional question in the 1990s was central to the emergence of an alternative voice, I think the constitutional debate, once again, is moving to the center of political debate. And I think the civil society groups are going to be key to moving that debate forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. Would you say, here's a question from Stefan Andresen, that prospects for democratization in Zimbabwe today are actually worse than they were at the time of independence in 1980, following on independence in 1980. And then let's just take another one from Jeremy Seekings. He says, Mnangagwa seems to have read the Raftopoulos playbook: keep the military on board, dispense some patronage, repress dissent, exacerbate factionism and opposition, and you can stay in power even if the economy remains a mess. What then should the opposition do? What is their strategy?
Okay. Let me take the first question on the prospects. I think at the moment, we've never been in such a dark position in terms of democratization. We're in a worse position than we've ever been, because there is the sense that there's very little regional pressure to push the existing regime towards any democratic reforms. The internal opposition is being dismantled, as I've said before. Globally, democratization has been on the decline for some time. And so there's a sense in which Mnangagwa's authoritarianism is speaking to a certain global growth of authoritarian rule. And that means that the battle for democracy now is not just about Zimbabwe. It's a global issue. And that both has challenges, but also opportunities, possibilities of making this Zimbabwe battle not just a national one, but a broader one, which can find broader allies. I think we have to find ways to do that. Jeremy's question, what should the opposition do? At the moment, the opposition has very little strategy. It's caught up in its own divisions, in its own splits, in its own lack of any long-term strategic capacity. And that's why I think, once again, the pressure for change is going to come at this moment from outside, from the civil society groups, who are going to have to push the opposition into rethinking its current strategic blockages. Because left to itself at the moment, the opposition is only going to sink further. It has no seeming answer to Mnangagwa's strategy at the moment. The elections, as we go closer to the elections, it's clear Mnangagwa's election campaign has already begun. And his idea is to try and, as I said, dismantle the capacity of the main opposition to fight those elections, and to try and take out, actually, to remove Chamisa before he gets to that election, possibly through some kind of judicial means. So we are facing a very, very tough, I would say this is the toughest position the opposition has been since it was formed in the 1990s. And it faces its most severe blockages.
Thanks, Brian. I gather Mletsi Mbeki has indicated he wants to ask a question, but Mletsi, could you type that in the chat room or on the Q&A? Meantime, let me ask one question. What about the role of the other powers, China and Russia? Do you see their influence, either positive or negative, going in any particular direction?
Okay, let me talk about that. Look, the Chinese and Russian influence has mainly been in the economics side, commercial agriculture, particularly in the tobacco industry for China, as well as in the mineral sector for Russia and China, as well as South African companies. Both China and Russia, we know globally, are not interested in terms of talking about rights questions within the post-colonial states. They much more interested in respecting the sovereignty of those countries and in dealing with the broader global influence, pushing China's global influence economically. And we're seeing that now. We're seeing China's global influence. It's increasing pressures in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, Hong Kong. We're seeing its influence in technology, in the consumption, global consumption. In many ways, China is a much more formidable foe for the West than the Soviet Union was, in my view. And for Russia, of course, is fighting its own pushback after the Cold War, when we saw NATO moving increasingly towards the borders of Russia. We know that many of those who became members of the EU first became members of NATO. So for Putin and his government, this is a pushback towards that, and they'll continue to do that. I don't see them having at this time any positive influence on the democratic debate. The economic side is another issue, but certainly on the democratic side, I don't see that being positive at the moment, given the global configuration of forces and the global battle for democratization. Is Moeletzi's question there?
No, I haven't seen Mletsi. Mletsi, if you could just type it in, please. Thanks. Yes. Sorry, Mletsi, I think it's easier if you just pose one or two questions rather than having a live intervention. So can I ask you to do that? In the meantime, can I ask if you were to venture a prediction of where Zimbabwe would be in the next 5 or 10 years? Brian, what would you say?
Oh, that's a difficult question. A lot is going to depend on the manner in which the civic and political opposition reconfigures itself, what happens in South Africa and in the region, and of course, the global struggles that are taking place and what new possibilities or obstacles those pose. I think it's very difficult to predict given the numerous dynamics that will have to come into play in order to begin to consider that question at all.
Okay, I see a question from Sheila Camera. In a recent SIA webinar on anticipatory governance, it was agreed amongst panelists that the emphasis by SADC on sovereignty of member states and non-interference, as well as the lack of a state prepared to assume leadership of SADC, is a big contributing factor to what is going on in Zimbabwe. By contrast, Nigeria has assumed the leadership role in West Africa. Does Prof. Raftopoulos agree?
I think broadly, yes. I think, as I try to say in my critique of SADC, it's the question of sovereignty has often been used as a means of not taking any action against authoritarian regimes, and that has weakened SADC as a body. And as I said, unless a particular country takes the lead, as South Africa did in 2007, 2008 in Zimbabwe, nothing will move in Zimbabwe. President Mbeki, ANC tried it in 2019. They sent two visits to Zimbabwe in 2020. These were largely just simply disregarded by ZANU-PF in almost a disrespectful way, because they felt they had broader support within SADC. They could afford to make this stand, and that's exactly what they did.
Okay. I see a question which I'm not quite sure if I can just dial it up. Is there a relationship between South Africa's foreign policy towards Zimbabwe, deployment of a crisis label, and immigration policy? I'm not really sure. Do you get the drift of that, Brian?
No, I don't. Can you expand on that?
Okay. So if we could ask Kudev and Yoro just to expand on that. Jeremy, do you have any responses to some of the questions or Brian's comments that you want to make at this time? Sorry, not Jeremy, Roger.
Yes, I was just going to ask, we've heard a lot about divisions within the opposition. What about the military? I think in the paper you talk a lot about some sort of divisions in the military at the top. What about amongst the soldiery? And there has been a lot of rumors about discontent at the lower levels of the army. Now, if ZANU-PF's control of the military goes, they've got problems. So could you talk a little bit about the military?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's not my particular area of research, but I've read a lot of the work that's been done by other Zimbabwean scholars. And they have talked about the divisions at lower level, the lack of, the worry about the loss of earning power, the lack of security, economic security. At one time, there was even some demonstrations amongst the lower groups. But at the moment, that has not developed into anything more. At the moment, there still seems to be some control from the center of the military. Again, that could change. But yeah, there have been factions within the military for a long time. It's not new. As scholars like Miles Tendi have noted, and others, that the factionalism within the military and between the military and the intelligence agencies was one of the problems with which led up to the coup. So that we don't know whether this factionalism will reemerge, but the potential for it is certainly there, and it's a concern.
Okay, and before I let Maletsi in, if I could ask one other question for Elena Tagar. The role of Robert Mugabe as an individual was paramount over decades of rulership. Considering his broad education and good intentions, what were the breaking points of his mismanagement in his own biography, and why? Well, okay, you get the drift of that. Brian?
Yeah, again, I mean, this is a long question. Mugabe, of course, was a very complicated figure. He really came to power effectively after divisions within ZANU in prison, and then effectively comes to power at the head of ZANU in 1977 in Mozambique. As we know, at first, the Mozambican government was not very close to him. They didn't trust him. They had problems with him. But increasingly, Mugabe's control of the military of ZANU was a result of him sidelining key figures within the military, within factions of the military who he felt were in his way. And for Mugabe, some of the central dynamics, of course, the anti-colonial narrative was key to his character, as it was to many nationalists and many critiques of colonialism. Also, of course, for him, the consolidation of power. Very early, the 1980s, Mugabe guided his party towards consolidating state power rather than dealing with the economy. He placed an emphasis on consolidating state power. And personal control as well was central to who he was. One can't speak about his individual idiosyncrasies. I didn't know him that well. There's things that have been said which I couldn't talk too much about. But certainly he was determined to balance as well ethnicities within ZANU-PF, and he tried to do that. But increasingly his party was seen as depending on one ethnic grouping. Increasingly alienated people within the military in his last years, when those around him were moving towards his succession. Those in the military, key military figures felt that he was disrespecting them. And increasingly that led to his own loss of control over the military, which led to the coup in 2017. And that loss of the military was a key for him losing power within both his party and of the state. Thank you.
Okay, Maletsi, if you could pose your questions briefly, and let's then get a response from the other panelists.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brian, I think thanks for the presentation, but I think there's a very critical part. Maybe we might have to find another time to deal with it, which is the opposition. MDC was not the first party to quite successfully challenge a liberation movement government. In fact, Oginga Odinga in Kenya in the 60s was one of the people who challenged the policies of the Jomo Kenyatta regime, and he wrote a famous book called Not Yet Uhuru. But I got the impression that MDC did not really take note of what had happened to the KPU, which was the Kenya People's Union that Oginga Odinga set up. So they went ahead as if there was no other African experience about opposing a liberation movement. Secondly, there was a huge amount of support for MDC in South Africa, especially from COSATU, from the trade unions. If you remember, COSATU even led a delegation to Zimbabwe and was deported from Zimbabwe. And COSATU asked Morgan, we were talking about sanctions, but the real sanctions that were put to MDC, they were not put to Mugabe, they were put to MDC, were put by COSATU to MDC and to Morgan Tsvangirai as to whether they want the unions in South Africa to, for example, blockade Beitbridge and stop goods going through Beitbridge. Morgan Tsvangirai and MDC said no. So now, because we pointed out to them that sanctions against South Africa were very critical in forcing the apartheid regime to the negotiating table. but MDC said they didn't want the sanctions. And then the last point I want to make is about the government of national unity that was negotiated. It was made very clear by several people, including President Ian Khama of Botswana, that MDC, the conditions of the government of national unity would just dig the ZANU-PF government out of the hole without giving a real change to the circumstances of control, as you point out, of the army, of the security forces, ability to rig the elections and so on. So can you just say a little bit about the errors of the opposition in Zimbabwe? Thank you.
Thank you, Moletsi. Yeah, look,
Thanks,
as I said, this would need a whole separate presentation. I did try to indicate some of the problems, and I've written about this elsewhere. Let me take up your points. First of all, the MDC did have contacts with people in Kenya for some time, and they never really studied it very deeply. And of course, we know what's happened in Kenya itself. The opposition is very much in a mess and very entangled with what's going on now with the current regime. So there were good and bad lessons to be learned from that. The second thing is your question about COSATU. That was key. The MDC strategy in the region was always a weak one. They tended to spend more of their advocacy time in the West, US and the EU. They're strategically in SADC and the region, they're always very weak. And I think the sanctions by COSATU would have been absolutely key in shifting the debate, not only in Zimbabwe, but within the ANC itself and within the polity of South Africa. And that I think I'd like to get more information about that myself, because I think it would have been a golden opportunity to change the debate on not only on Zimbabwe, but on liberation movements in the region as a whole. And that would have been key. With the GNU, yes, you're right. They were warned, but they felt they didn't have an option. They felt if they didn't go into that, they had no alternative strategy. This wasn't like the days of the liberation movement where if you refused to go into electoral politics, you could go to war. That option wasn't open to them, thankfully. But so for them, the option was either go into this GNU or stay out in the cold and stay at the mercy of this regime with SADC increasingly pulling back. And that was the calculation. And not to forget that, remember, for opposition politicians, for politicians as a whole, politics is not just about principles, it's about jobs, it's about work. That's a reality. So that this was also a calculation. This was about going into a job where they would, at least for the next 5 years, have paid employment, have various kind of perks that would come their way. This is a calculation for all politicians. And it certainly was not absent within the MDC. So there were many factors here, and I think that they would need to be looked at jointly and in that complex fashion. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to draw proceedings to a conclusion now. Roger, do you have any concluding comments that you wish to make or questions?
No, I don't. Brian's covered an enormously wide range of territory. I'd just like to say thanks very much for a fascinating talk.
Thank you very much, Roger. Well, I'd like to echo that, Brian. It's been really a model presentation in terms of breadth, depth, but also absolutely succinct commentary. And I think we're all the richer for your presentation today and the way that you've dealt with the questions. And I very much look forward to welcoming you back for your fourth presentation at some point in the future. So thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And it's been a great evening. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Roger. And thank you to the team. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.